Worldview-Agility podcast. Hello and welcome. My name is Carsten Ohrmann. Many thanks for tuning in. This is actually the first English language episode of the Worldview-Agility podcast, and I'm very happy to welcome all of the English-speaking audience now to our podcast as well. In today's session, we are going to speak with Simon North. Simon and I know each other for many years. He's a dear friend and coaching colleague, and we have had a number of conscious conversations already during the course of the years. In this brief first English language episode, we are going to talk about consciousness and conscious conversations in general, but also about sources of inspirations, unconscious and conscious processes, and particularly like-minded people. We recorded this particular conversation on the 2nd of March 2022. And now, enjoy listening. You know that I have these conscious conversations, and we are having conscious conversations for years, right? And there is one person I'm having conscious conversations with, whom I've met on this social media platform Clubhouse a year ago, and but we then decided we would want to leave Clubhouse again, and we would have conscious conversations were dedicated to record audios for later publishing them as podcasts.
As what?
As podcasts.
As podcasts, right? Yeah.
And that is what we've now done. We have basically recorded, I think, the order of magnitude of around 15, 16 sessions, and I've now started to roll, not really sophisticatedly, but just to edit them in a way that I cut off the front, which is just sort of a social welcome chit chat, how are you doing, and the end, which is typically around, okay, when are we going to meet next, right? So these two bits and pieces I'm basically cutting off, but then I leave everything else intact, and I just add an intro and an outro to it, and then I've basically got an episode for a podcast, and I've now prepared 8 podcast episodes and have uploaded them onto my YouTube channel in a specific playlist. So there is now a way to basically listen to these conversations, and that's what's keeping me busy. But it's a good exercise, and it really sort of encourages me as well, because when listening to these conversations, obviously they are not scripted, they are not sort of predetermined conversations, but listening to them, they just have evolved as really nice, useful conversations, and they are, at least from my point of view, they are worth listening to.
And how long do they last?
Around an hour usually.
Okay.
Around an hour, although there are 2 episodes which are slightly longer, with an hour 15 or an hour 20, but it's typically around an hour.
And are they on specific subjects, or are they sort of quite wide-ranging?
There is a commonality in that it's all around this information field hypothesis. So it's all about the nature of reality, but then what the implications of this hypothesis would be, right? And hence we are talking about, for example, high performance teams. We are talking about holistic leadership. We are talking about trauma. We are talking about all of these kind of different things, and always related back and say, okay, how would we deal with these things if the information field hypothesis would be true, if we would live in what I declare as the green worldview perspective, right? So we are basically taking all of these different areas, it's a variety of things, and then we are trying to look at it through the lens of this green worldview perspective, of this information field based understanding of reality. And for example, like when the war in the Ukraine actually started, we had planned anyhow to have a podcast recording the following day. So we spoke about the fact that there is war and conflicts and all these kind of things, and if the same would happen if we would live in a green worldview environment, right? So that was one of the episodes which we basically sort of brought forward. We've published it immediately. So the recording was just basically published the podcast the same day that the recording was, but which was unusual because we had created all of this backlog of recordings, and I was subsequently publishing them. But the Ukraine war kind of episode we have brought forward and published immediately.
Very good. I've just been looking up some guy who I know in the UK who's one of two partners in a leadership consulting business. It's very young and it's not really taken off much. I know his partner better than I know him, but I know them both. And yesterday he said on LinkedIn that he was about to record his 50th podcast, and he was saying thank you to all those, who the other 49, of which I was one. I must admit I haven't listened to very many of them, but he's done something similar to you, and I think just looked at he's got those podcasts in the bank. He's got about 4,000 followers who I guess are feeding on them to whatever degree. Trying to think. I think with him, we agreed that we would talk about 3 questions. So it gave me a chance to think about it, not to make any notes or write anything. And we just had this discussion under, quite stringent recording conditions. And then for the editor, he just clapped his hands when we were shifting from one question to another. We just took a breath and then went again. It was quite interesting process, I found, to sort of order your thoughts around. Well, it's a lot, not dissimilar to the sort of thing we've done, over the years, really, but with maybe a little bit more structure around process and time. But I think it's a good idea, and I guess for you, you're not trying to see an end game. You're not trying to say I'm doing this because I'm being paid, or you're doing it as a sort of like a legacy conversation that people can tap into.
Literally, it is exactly that. Retrospectively, I look at these conversations that I was having with people like yourself over the years, and I always felt that they are very, very insightful, also for myself, right? This is almost like we are opening up a co-creative space where things pop up in my mind or in the conversation, which would have probably not popped up outside that setting. So I just felt that is a very creative space, a very useful space. And
yeah, I agree. And I mean, do you listen back to any of your recordings at different times, or not really?
Hardly not. I'm now thinking whether I should basically also revisit some of these other conscious conversations recordings, which were not dedicated to end up in a podcast, right? So that is the difference between what we've done now and what I've done before, right? And so I have got tons of materials, and I'm not really listening back to them, but still, whenever I do, I'm literally amazed about what we are talking about, right? It's really good. It's really good.
Yeah. So one of the reasons I think it's likely to be good is that they emerge. The conversations emerge. There's nothing other than the moment in time that triggers what comes. And I think, when we consider, how it is to live in 2022, how it is that we manage or do stuff in 2022 compared to other times, you look back and think how driven we were, sort of driven like a shepherd drives sheep on a trail when they move them, or when they move them into pens to treat them or whatever. You don't have the same freedom of space. You've used that term a couple of times already, where you're allowing somebody the time and the space to think through something with no end point, with no sense of, well, I've got to cover that. I've got to hurry up because someone else, we've got to get it on to the next agenda item, or whatever it may be. Because so much of our life is crammed with things that we need to do on a timeline, everything, including when we sleep and when we eat and everything, right? So to actually have the freedom of expression, but the space to do it, just allow yourself to go. I think it's a real privilege that we have.
I think this is a great observation. And building on that, I think this space is almost a prerequisite for things to pop up. And now I just think about where these things might come from. I mean, we can always say it comes out of our consciousness, right? But in this green worldview perspective, our consciousness just is not necessarily ending with our own kind of limited body, right? So the interesting thing is, if you allow this space, and if you're in the moment, and if you're not sort of restricting yourself to achieve certain goals and to whatever, so if you are really free and you're in the moment, I think that opens up the space for something which I would probably loosely call inspirations. So ideas, intuitive kind of things which pop up out of nowhere. I mean, right? It just happens. Right? And I think it is indeed almost a prerequisite to create these spaces for these inspirations to be received. Because if we keep ourselves occupied with this plan, okay, and then we need to do this, and hopefully this next question is not going to take too long because I still have 3 other questions which I would want to ask, all these kind of things, right? I think we're keeping ourselves too busy then to listen to inspirational impulses, which might probably even exist, but we overhear them. We can't actually recognize them, right? And I think that's the benefit of allowing the space, of not having an agenda, of just truthfully being there and listen. I mean, this is also a coaching skill, right? The active.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, what we give here is, this is a gift to ourselves and the others by really tuning into the other.
Well, I absolutely agree. And I think there's something about the relationship between unconsciousness and what comes into our conscious state when given the preconditions, as it were, that you're describing. So, for example, this is definitely true of coaching, and you can hear it and you can see it in coachees when this happens, that you have probably been unconsciously processing an awful lot of stuff. You think about the brain as a processing agent, if you will. The amount that comes into consciousness and or then speaking must be a small proportion of what is in the total bank of brain power. Yes. So I think it's really interesting when you hear yourself articulate something which sounds well thought through, and yet for the first time you're saying it. Yeah. I was thinking about this apropos Ukraine. So yesterday I had a couple of conversations where the issue of Ukraine came up and how people were responding emotionally to it, in terms of what they were seeing and feeling about it. And I was a part of the conversation, but I wasn't contributing hugely. I was listening, I think. And then I found myself 24 hours later, sort of coming up with scenarios and almost sort of solutioning around, where is this going to end? Obviously there've been lots of other inputs through the news channels or whatever to build out one's data in a sort of conscious sense. But it's just so interesting how these things manifest into our world when it's given the chance to. Because nobody really, somebody like me, having my thoughts about it are, in a sense, they're inconsequential, but there must be millions of other people around the world who are going through similar sorts of unconscious and conscious processing around similar stuff, and then you see it articulated in supra organizational, places like I don't know, like the UN or the State of the Nation last night in America and all the rest of it. You think, is that it? Yeah, they probably captured a lot of it, but is that really it? Just lovely to sort of see the juxtaposition of that, really.
Yeah. And I think we underestimate the power of that content of what you labeled as unconscious.
I think so. I mean, and actually, I think in a way, the way that things are being played out, this is what I was thinking about this morning. It's almost like the military campaign is the conscious thing that you see photographed from the air and hear from the devastation on the ground and the migrants and so on. The unconscious is what is happening outside our understanding. It's almost sort of underneath the things that will change the way that the Russian people believe. I can no longer use my credit card to buy my gas or my groceries or whatever it may be. I was hoping that I would leave Moscow to go and see my relatives in Germany. I now can't because there's no way I can get an airplane, whatever. And so you've got these two things happening almost at the state level of behavior and so on. So yeah, I think I've always been fascinated by the fact that you're the only person that I speak to on a regular basis who records the conversations, and I know that you do that with other people as well. So you're building this sort of wellspring of well, whatever you call it. I mean, it's
I call it conscious conversations.
Okay. Well, exactly. Yeah.
And you can sort of, on average, I mean, this is a pretty simple kind of numbers game, but on average, if you assume that I'm recording one session a day, you can imagine that, and this is typically around an hour, right?
Yeah.
So that makes it 350. A couple of days left in the year, 350 hours of recording every year, and I'm doing this for a number of years, right?
Yeah.
And I think the 350 per year is still a conservative number, right? So it's I have a lot of conscious conversations, so I've got literally tons of material.
So the question then is going to be, how you mine it, or whether you don't even do that, but through the conversations you learn who it is. But I had one of the texts I had this morning relates to a business mentoring business that started here a couple of years ago, and I was introduced to them just through my network, and I've done a little bit of work with them, and it's basically run by a young guy and his father. So they're the co-founders, but the boss is the younger one. I guess he's in his late 20s. He's a really sharp guy, really good. And they've been going through loads of the sort of growing pains that you do as a young business, but they've also been approached by an investor who wants to put money into the business, but also give them a piece of technology that will change the platform, right? Now, I keep in touch with this business. They like talking to me about stuff. And I got a text this morning, would I be free? Because they want to talk about the range of decisions that they're on the cusp of making about the future of their business. Now, in a sense, it's another of these sort of conversations. I'm in their orbit. I'm not the only person they will check out, for sure, but it's sort of nice to be included in the thinking, because I guess they feel I've got a view that is worth something to them. I don't know. I've never bothered checking what it is their need is, but I quite like hanging out with them because I think they've got an interesting idea and they've made some progress. They're good people. I think they could go somewhere, and they're worth hanging out with. That's the bottom line, isn't it? It's who you hang out with in your network, really.
It is. And I think we are developing a kind of a natural sense. I'm bringing my most favorite word of like-minded people in here again, right? So we are, I think we are screening the environment and we are determining who we declare as like-minded or who we consider as like-minded and who we therefore would want to hang out with. And I think that is a necessity for these kind of environments and settings to evolve, because I don't know, I've never tried this consciously, but I would assume that the same level of co-creative inspirational space would not happen with a non-like-minded person, right? So if I would try to engage in a conscious conversation with a non-like-minded person, and there is even an inner resistance when I say the sentence, because for me that wouldn't work. It wouldn't be a conscious conversation. It would just be a normal conversation, but not a conscious conversation if it would be a non-like-minded person. But I think there is this kind of like-mindedness sort of actually helps the quality of the emerging conversation.
I agree. I think what you're describing in my mind is the difference between diversity and inclusion. Because inclusion, in my mind, makes assumptions about all of those conditions that we've been talking about. Respect, listening, space, safety, those sorts of things that we know from the coaching ethics are predeterminant of having a high quality conversation, whereas diversity, like-mindedness, does not mean that everybody agrees with each other, that they can't have a contra opinion on something from their own experience base or their cultural insights or whatever it may be. So I think you're right. I think that, I find when my wife comes back from work, and she works in a school environment, so there's lots of managers and governors as well as parents and young people, so it's a very rich and diverse thing. The thing she most often picks on to talk about is where the like-mindedness has fallen short, and it's usually a behavioral thing.
Yes,
you would expect somebody like that to, I don't know, listen better or whatever it may be. Rather than the specific content, which is interesting.
Worldview-Agility podcast. Many thanks for staying with us. If you've enjoyed that conversation, please feel free to recommend this podcast to others as well. You can find all our episodes on www.worldview-agility.com. Again, many thanks for listening and hope to see you again soon. All the best, yours, Carsten Ohrmann.